Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Making Sense of Sensory Education at the ARC of Virginia State Convention. We're so glad you've joined us today for this session. In the interest of time, speakers will introduce themselves. My name is Sean Kirk, and I'm a liaison with the Ally Alliance. Before we get started, we want to remind you to be sure and check your schedules for the exciting opportunities during the convention. One of our new and exciting projects this year is Quilla Connect. Please sure to stop by the Quilla Connect table, which is right across from registration, over the next few days so you can learn more. Thank you for joining us today. And session leader, the floor is yours.
Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm Corey Gates. I go by Corey. You're welcome to call me that. I'm an occupational therapist, and I am absolutely honored to be here. Sensory integration is something I'm very passionate about, my own personal life and my professional life. And so any opportunity to educate the community, engage with the community, and be a resource, I am so grateful for. So thank you so much for being here. I tend to be a pretty informal presenter. I have trouble staying still, so I will walk around, I will fidget, I will do all sorts of those things. I also am open to questions at any moment. If anybody has a thought or a question, something they want to share, jump in and I'm happy to talk about it. I know we're starting a little bit late, and I know, which is totally fine. That's how my whole life goes. And I know we also have about a total of 60 minutes. And I just want to start by saying there is an enormous amount of information that we are packing into a very, very small amount of time. I've been practicing occupational therapy for almost 13 years, and sometimes I still feel like I know nothing about sensory integration. It's like the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. So please, by the end of this hour, don't expect to be able to go explain all of this or understand it all. Just know that we're just sort of getting started, and hopefully I will provide you with some resources that you can follow up and learn more. So just a quick little bit about me. I've been an OT for about 13 years. I work in pediatrics, so a lot of my information in my examples, I will tend to gear towards pediatrics, but I also have done some work with adults as well, primarily because in my work with pediatrics, I was educating parents, and the parents were like, well, where do I go? Like, I have all these issues and differences too. Where do I go to talk about this? So I do some work with adults as well. I also do teaching. I teach for University of South Dakota, and I teach for St. Catherine University doing labs for their OT assistant program. So my areas of expertise and interest are pediatric mental health and sensory integration. So I have a lot of sensory issues myself. I will always remember the day in graduate school that they were teaching us about sensory integration. It was just like a light bulb. That was really honestly life-changing for me, because it was like, aha, like all of these things that I've struggled with my entire life, like here's a name for them, and here's what they mean, and here's why they, might impact me. And that was very validating. And I love getting to sort of be a catalyst for other people learning that same information. Okay, so I do tend to talk fast, so slow me down if you need to. I get really excited and really animated, so bring me back in if you need. I want to also start by finding out who is in the audience. So I would like you to raise your hand if you're here because you are neurodivergent or have a disability and you are interested in learning for yourself. Okay, a couple people. Okay. Awesome. Okay, so raise your hand if you're here because you are a caregiver of somebody who is neurodivergent or, okay, all right. So raise your hand if you're here because you are a clinician or work in advocacy services or in the medical field. Okay, so good mix. Raise your hand if you fit into multiple of those categories. Okay, all right. So anybody who has a nervous system is going to be impacted by sensory integration, right? We all have brains, we all have a nervous system, so it impacts all of us. So this is information that I truly believe should be shouted from the rooftops in every venue possible. So, okay. One other quick polling question.
Raise your hand if you've heard of sensory integration before. That's wonderful. Okay. How about, and I'm sorry, I know your arms might be getting tired, but how about raise your hand if you feel like you know a ton about sensory integration. You could explain it to other people. You know what you're talking about. Okay, so we have a few experts in the audience. Okay, raise your hand if you are like, I know nothing, I've heard the word, and I need to know everything. Okay. All right. A good amount. Okay. Awesome. That is, I feel like, the category I am in. Okay. Thank you. So that helps me to kind of tailor my comments and answers a little bit, just based on knowing who is out there. Okay. So before we dive into talking about occupation or talking about sensory integration, I want to again reiterate the fact that this is by no means a comprehensive, exhaustive lecture on sensory integration. It is really introductory, which is great. For some people that know a good amount, it will be review. And I always think it's wonderful to have review every time I go to a presentation or watch something or read an article on sensory integration or anything for that matter. I always pull out something new. So hopefully if it's review, great. If it's brand new, that's okay too. And again, sometimes I think it's really overwhelming. Like when I'm educating caregivers or doing these presentations, people come away being like, wait, I expect to be able to like educate others now. And that's not what we're expecting. So I think it's important for us to manage our expectations. Okay. So I have to start by saying, what is occupational therapy? Has anybody heard of it? Anybody had it?
Yeah.
I should. All right. Yes. Okay. So occupational therapy is function-based therapy. So anything you do in your daily life would be considered an occupation. And an occupational therapist, OT for short, our job is to help people live their best lives. It's kind of hard to define, I think, because we kind of do everything, which can make it tricky to define, but we really do look at anything that would be inhibiting your ability to engage in what you need to do in your daily life would be something an OT would address. And we have lots of different specialty areas. I work in pediatrics. There's some people that just do assistive tech, some people that just do physical disabilities, some people that just do psychosocial, some people that just do splinting. So we are a jack of all trades, master of many. And so we look at different areas of occupation, self-care skills, social and leisure occupations, academic or work-related occupations. So really occupation refers to anything that you would do in your daily life. And then when you are working as an OT or with an OT, interventions might be group-based or individual-based. So we work in a lot of different capacities as well. Yeah, ooh, go back. Okay, absolutely. Also, this presentation is available for you all to print. I think we may have some copies that might be floating around somewhere. And if we're able to get those for you, then we will have those available. If not, you're welcome to print them. Yes. You would like a copy? All right, we've got some people that would like copies. So hopefully we will be able to get those to you. Yep, consultative.
Sorry, I'm usually very fast at this, but I'm not.
That's okay. I'm usually not very fast at typing, so. Direct or individual. Absolutely. Yep. Yes. Go ahead. Awesome. That's right. That's wonderful. And that's what OT is all about. It's not being normal or typical or, you know, getting some level of where everyone else is at. It's about improving your own life. Okay. You're welcome. Okay. So why do we look at sensory? Why do we care about sensory? We care about sensory because it forms the foundation for how we interact with the world. It's the foundation for how we take all of the information that's coming from this world around us and from our internal worlds, our internal systems, and it's how we engage in daily functioning. It is literally the foundation of everything we do in our daily life. So whether you have a diagnosis or not a diagnosis, or you're neurodivergent or neurotypical, we all are we all are impacted by sensory. And it's the connection between our brain and our body health. It's how we keep ourselves healthy and how we meet our needs. It's a foundation for our mental health and our well-being. And one really super important reason why we should consider sensory is because we can make changes based on what we know about ourselves. Because of neuroplasticity, we have the ability to change the way we interact and the way we perceive things. When you have sensory differences, you will always have sensory differences, but you can close the gap as far as how much they impact your daily function. And it's also validating. Like, I will always remember that day in graduate school. It was like, aha, this is what's been wrong with me or different about me my whole life. And it was cool. I figured out, okay, that's why I throw up when I go on a swing set. And that was really validating. So sensory is important for everyone. Yeah. No, and I really wish I had. I think OT when I was younger would have been really beneficial and life-changing for me. And I do wish I had had it. But then also I wonder if maybe I wouldn't do what I do for a living. And I absolutely love my job. I love what I get to do for a living. So I love that question too. I've never been asked that question in a presentation, and I always will, or I should say I will frequently volunteer that I should have had it and I didn't. So I think one thing that's really interesting to think about sensory integration is the research being done into sensory integration was being done in the 1970s, which was actually not very long ago. So we're still relatively new with learning about it. Okay, so I'm not going to get too much into the science and the technical definitions of things because I want to tailor this to our audience, and I also want to be aware of our time. When I I'm a guest lecturer at the local community college here in their OT program, and we spend 3 hours just going over these definitions. So there's no way we'll even scratch the surface of it, but I do want to introduce some of the lingo. So the general definition of sensory integration is taking information from your body, our internal systems, and the external world around us, and integrating all of that information together to be able to engage in our daily life. We use all this input to create our perceptions of the world and our perceptions of ourselves, and to form interactions with the world. And then we figure out how did those interactions work, and then we make adjustments based on that. So it influences our behavior and our learning, and it also is shaped by our behavior and our learning. So there's a reason why I'm a pediatric OT and I don't have a job where I sit at a desk. I really would have a hard time with that. I'm having a hard time even standing, right? So I'm walking around and fidgeting with my son's loader truck. So it really shapes who we are, and what we expose ourselves to based on what we like further shapes our sensory needs, right? So if you were not good at typing for whatever reasons, and you expose yourself to typing, you can use your sensory differences to change things about yourself.
Yeah, I guess I told him there
Yeah, so you use it for leisure, right? You probably were put in OT to work on typing because you needed it maybe for like academics, but it shapes your leisure. So absolutely, and it all goes hand in hand. Okay, so sensory integration comes from the nervous system. It comes from the brain, and that's really important to remember because all of the theories and research and treatment interventions that we use in occupational therapy is all based on science, right? There's some art to occupational therapy, so it's like an art form, but it's also a science, and it's important to remember that it is rooted in many different developmental theories and also many different sciences. So it's important to know about the body physically from a kinesiology perspective, and it's important to know about the psychology and also neurology too. So many different things. Modulation, yes, question? Going to town this week? On the popper? Oh, you're going to helicopter in town?
amazing. So it is your sensory integration, your brain that allows you to be excited about that. My brain would be like, no, thank you. So that is awesome. So that's an example of how our sensory differences shape what we want to do for fun. It blows my mind that there's people that go for rides for fun. I'm like, wait, what do you mean for fun? I'm in the car because I have to be. Okay, so a couple quick definitions. Sensory discrimination is our ability to differentiate stimuli. It's what allows me to look out at the sea of people and see that there's some people that have glasses and some people that don't. It's what allows me to differentiate between I can hear my phone ringing or it's a phone on the TV. So their discrimination is differentiating stimuli. And modulation is our ability to sort of prioritize and filter out environmental stimuli. And it's our brain's ability to sort of inhibit some responses and pay attention to other responses. Yeah.
So discrimination after it says that it's a skill, is modulation not a skill?
Modulation is more your sensitivity level. So it kind of is what it is. And sensory discrimination is how we use the information for skill. So an example of discrimination would be like looking out and differentiating, like you just spoke, it wasn't you that spoke. Modulation would be hearing you speak and then my brain tuning out somebody else kind of speaking in the background. So modulation, when we have difficulty with modulation, we have difficulty like inhibiting responses. So for somebody that was saying earlier that the feel of the bed sheets bothers them. Yeah, I didn't want to call you out, but you called yourself out. So yes. So, and that your brain has difficulty tuning out that feeling. And so that's a function of modulation. Okay. And then processing is the ability to sort of take your information in your discrimination and go through the process of like registering that a stimulus has happened, orienting to that stimulus, figuring out how you're going to respond to that stimulus, executing the response to that stimulus, and then assessing how did it work. So here's an example. I have an itch. First, I have to notice there is an itch on my body. Then I have to notice, okay, where is it? Oh, it's on my back. And then I have to figure out what am I going to do about it? Am I going to scratch it? Am I going to ignore it? Am I going to hit it? And then I assess how did that work? So that's the sensory processing. And then we use sensory input from all of our different sensory channels, which we're going to talk. I'm giving you guys kind of the general, and then we're going to talk about each specific sensory channel. So sensory input is used from all of our different sensory channels to, again, form our interactions with the world. And I will say this again, shout it from the rooftops. It is foundational for all of our functional skills. So as a pediatric OT, I'll get a prescription that comes in that says, a child is having trouble with writing. Well, if just sitting and practicing writing was going to work for that child, it would already be working. So as an OT, my job is to look at those underlying things and see what might be impacting. One time I got a prescription that said child falls out of chair multiple times a day in kindergarten, and so just practicing sitting in a chair wasn't going to work for that child, right? I had to look and figure out the underlying, like what is going on there? Why is that child falling out of the chair? My parents knew as a kid that Corey gets car sick and swing set sick and escalator sick and elevator sick. And, it would have been really cool to kind of learn why. Now I know why. I do. And I do. I prefer to take the stairs. I can be on an elevator if I need to. It's not my favorite time. I will not be very social on an elevator. If I get on an elevator, I like to be towards the edge so I can kind of hold on and be grounded a little bit. And one time we were staying in a hotel and we were on like the 7th or 8th floor. And so I'd be doing the stairs and my husband was like, okay, Corey, like we're taking the elevator. We've gone up and down these stairs a million times. We're doing the elevator. Yeah.
So the person give them that stimuli to be able to focus.
You don't even know how important your question is. So, or maybe you do know,
I,
what your
well,
question is.
that's my main question today. How does it work?
Yes. So her question was, if somebody has sensory modulation difficulties and you give them some type of input,
Yeah.
right? Why do you do that, or how does that work?
Right.
So that is like, I could teach a whole semester, 8 hours a day on answering that question. But just in a quick nutshell, so when you are having difficulty with sensory input in one channel, you may respond actively by getting upset, freaking out, whatever, or you may respond passively by like shutting down. And we can use sensory input from that same sensory channel to help regulate, or we may use sensory input from another channel to help regulate. So here's an example. Yeah, it is, and it's trial and error. Yes.
Channel, the button, or what comes in that channel.
So a sensory channel refers to a kind of sensory input. So vision is a sensory channel, hearing is a sensory channel, touch is a sensory channel. So there's not a great answer to that because it's so abstract and it's different and it's trial and error. What works for somebody in one moment might not work in the other moment. So here's an example. So I have a lot of auditory sensitivities. I have a really hard time with the sound of people chewing. My husband happens to be the world's loudest chewer. What?
Is that war breakfast?
I think it might be. You tell me. So what helps me if he's chewing something, what helps me, an example of using the same sensory channel would be me also eating. Because I find that,
You can't just yell at them.
well, I do that. No, I think so. If I, like, let's say if he's eating chips and the sound is bothering me, well, if I start eating chips, then I'm hearing my own chips eating. Also, that's kind of also both examples because the chewing gives me muscle input that helps override. So another example would be if anybody ever been outside and it's too sunny, okay, and you put sunglasses on, that's an example of self-regulation. When I get really farsick, it really helps me to get up and walk around. So that would be an example of using a different sensory channel. So wonderful question. Moving target answer. Okay. Yeah.
For incoming sensory sickness, do you have like acid reflux or something, or just moving?
I have that as well,
Have it.
but sort of unrelated. But there is an overlap.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. No, that's okay. I will give you lots of TMI about myself today. You will know all sorts of differences about me. Okay, so who is affected by sensory integration? Everybody. Yes.
I thought you were right. Sorry.
Oh, who is? Yeah, I love it, girl. You're like, yes, me. I'm affected by it. Yeah. So anybody that has a brain in a nervous system is affected by sensory regulation, right? My dog had some sensory issues, and he also has a nervous system, and I was able to use some of my same strategies on him as well. Okay, so between 5 and 16% of the population, we all have sensory preferences, right? We all have things we like, we all have things that we don't like. That doesn't mean we all have sensory processing disorder, right? That just means we're all humans. So between 5 and 16% of the population would actually qualify for a sensory processing disorder. And OTs have been talking about this since the 70s. However, it wasn't until I think the first functional MRI studies came out in like 2014 that actually gives some really nice neurological evidence that says, yes, we see differences in how the brain fires and wires. So between 5 and 16% would qualify for a sensory processing disorder. Now, if we put that into perspective, that's a huge percentage of our population. If we think about, let's say, autism, that's about like 2% of our population, right? So if we think about SPD, sensory processing disorder, that's actually pretty prevalent. Then if we look at a gifted population, so somebody that we qualify as being gifted in an area academically, it jumps up to 45%. So it is interesting. We have a lot of smart, quirky people, right? Okay. So people there's huge overlap in comorbidities because it comes from the brain. Anything that affects brain development, you might be more likely to have sensory processing disorder or sensory processing differences. So the huge overlap between people with autism, people with attention deficit disorders, people with genetic disorders, people with learning disabilities.
huge overlap and correlation there. And also there's a huge overlap between trauma histories too, which we're learning more and more about. Our sensory integration system starts developing in utero. So even when babies are in the wombs, those foundations are developing. And it's interesting because I have vestibular difficulties, which is why I get motion sickness. And my mom was really sick during pregnancy. So I think she laid down a lot, to regulate herself. So it's interesting because the vestibular system starts developing really early. Okay. So just a quick stat, more than 80% of children, now this would apply to adults as well, but the research article I got this from was on children. So more than 80% of children with ASD experience sensory processing differences. And I would argue that I have never worked with somebody that had an ADHD or an autism. I said that wrong. More than 80% with autism, I'm sorry. Apologize. So I have never worked with somebody that has had that diagnosis that didn't also have sensory processing differences or difficulties. And I say differences and difficulties because you can have sensory processing differences and they might not be a problem. I was all throughout graduate school, I was a bartender, and I was a phenomenal bartender, if I do say so myself, because I have a very sensitive auditory system. So I will hear people. I could hear people like across the room being like, oh, I'm gonna go get a drink. And I would have it ready for them. Wow. And then I also have a really good visual memory. So I'm terrible with names, but great with faces. So I can remember this face goes with this drink. So it made me a really good bartender. It makes it really hard for me to study in a public place, right? So our differences can be an asset. So just having something that you're more sensitive or less sensitive to isn't necessarily an issue. So children or adults with sensory processing disorders are at much greater risk for anxiety and depression. So I think that is a really important point that needs to be underlined, highlighted, because it's part of the so what, why do we care? We want people in our society to be happy. Society benefits from people being happy, right? They contribute and participate more in society. So it is really important that we address sensory needs and differences and have this knowledge because it will help make people less anxious and less depressed. My brothers joke that I get weirder as I get older. And I'm like, actually, no, boys, I've always been this weird. I just know what it's called now and I can advocate for myself now, right? So I can say what I need now and I know what it is. Before, I just always kind of felt yucky as a kid. I was always kind of sick and I just didn't feel great all the time. And now I'm like, oh, guys, actually, I'm not going to wear a turtleneck or a halter top because I know that doesn't feel right on me. I'm not going to, I literally have moved seats at a conference in the past because I was like, oh, ice chewer near me, I'm out, so it's about figuring out what your needs are and advocating for yourself. Okay. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. I do want to make note of the fact, and we're going to go after this, I'm going to go into each sensory channel. So I do want to make note of the fact that there is one, this is outdated, there is a sensory channel that is missing from here, and it's called interoception. So I started to draw it in here, and then I was like, ooh, that's copyrighted. I don't think I can just draw it. I was like, I'll just tell them about it. So interoception, we'll talk about what that means later. So sensory integration lays the foundation for everything we do. And I love using this visual because, again, I'll have parents that will come in and say, my child's having difficulty in school or difficulty brushing teeth, or they're aggressive, they're having difficulty with behavior or social anxiety. And I'm down here being like, all right, let's talk about these things. Because if we address these things, we can create a better foundation for the higher level things. So sensory integration is the foundation for our arousal state, which is our alert state and our energy level. It's what lets us know, hey, I'm really tired. I need to do something to wake myself up. Or I need to go to bed. It's what lets us know, hey, my energy level is a little too intense right now. I have an almost 53 next week, not next year, next week. And sometimes I'll get really excited about what he's doing. And I'm just coming on too strong. And he's like, so he'll now say, too much, Mom. And so that's me being like, okay, well, I'm really excited. My energy level is up and I can kind of regulate my arousal a little bit. Yeah. What about those who have a hard time sleeping? Yeah. So
shower window and you want it to go down just a little bit, but it goes down way too much. And then you're like, okay, let me let it go up a little bit, it goes up way too much, modulation dysfunction. And so people that have difficulty with regulating those arousal states might have a modulation. So you're like, do you just like crash too? No. So you'll go pee for days and then like I do sleep one night. Okay, so you probably have had struggle with that your whole life, I'm guessing, and you probably have found some ways to kind of regulate yourself on your own. Your life might be shaped by it. For example, what you do for a living might be shaped by it, or what you do for leisure might be shaped by it. So I don't know if I have a great answer for you as how to fix it. But I can validate you in the fact that there probably is a foundation in your head.
Question. My son, he'll sit in something quiet. This time he was big, and I given schedule, and so he said he worked. I told him.
Yeah.
In your life, bring it in.
Yeah.
He did that and it worked. So that's sort of.
Absolutely. So when we are engaging in those games, that blue light that comes off, it sends a different message to our brain. It says, wake up, upregulate. And what we need to do is downregulate, go to sleep. And what people need is different. So like I actually fall asleep great with the TV on. My husband cannot fall asleep with the TV on. So there's no like, hey, this is the way it always is. It fluctuates. Advice is a mama though.
But lately, like, I'm just trying to make my family sleep because I don't have to work on sleeping a lot. You know, they're not doing siesta or something.
Yeah. Yeah, potentially. And you could even like, so for some people that afternoon siesta might work great for your lifestyle. My husband does his best work day when he can take an afternoon siesta. Might be 30 minutes, it might be an hour, and then he'll get more work. But if it's inhibiting your work, your day, if it's a problem, then that might be something.
Depends on the day. Some stuff I have to like to do all night, too much for lunch, and like, or sleep.
So those things all make a difference, and our choices make a difference, but that's where we can make changes too. So I think of modulation as the ability to grade something, right? Grade your voice volume, grade your physical movements. Like right now, my energy is up, and it's appropriate for my energy, right? This is an appropriate time for my arousal state to be a little bit elevated. So grading physical movements is when you give somebody a high five, what allows you to know how hard you slap or how hard you don't slap. Grading your voice volume, it's the foundation for our posture. So if we are getting tired, we need more, and that's a function of our sensory. Behavioral regulation, if I have been car sick or if I've been near people chewing that were really bothering me and it wasn't socially appropriate for me to move or get away from it, then I'm going to be grumpier, right? So it is the foundation for our social interactions too, and our behavioral interactions. Also the foundation for social skills. I used to work with this woman who I love, she's a wonderful person, but she could not grade her personal space. So she was always so close, and I'd be like, and she'd be like, and I'd be like that. And person, like I actually really liked her as a person, but it was something that was always kind of a factor. So foundation for social skills, foundation for motor planning. I was a kid that I was the last kid in my neighborhood to get training wheels off my bike. I still barely ride a bike. So it's the foundation for how adept are we at using our bodies to engage in things. And it might be big things like riding a bike or playing sports, or it might be something small like, can I use this hairbrush? Do I know where my head is? Do I know where my head is? Do I know where my hand is? It's also our foundation for mapping out and planning time. When I was learning about this, I remember calling one of my high school friends and being like, Melissa, I figured out why we could never figure out what time we had to leave to get somewhere. We have temporal processing issues. And she was like, okay. So like for me, I have a really hard time, like this one, I have a really hard time figuring out like what time do I need to get up, what time do I need to leave to get there. So I always have to like work backwards. Some people are really good at that. I am not one of those people. I have a
hard time mapping out time and space on a big scale, like, okay, when is somebody's birthday? But also on a small scale, if you were to throw a ball at me, I would have a hard time getting my body in position to catch it. Okay, and there's a huge link to our executive functions. Executive functions are your higher level brain skills that allows you to like problem solve, plan, organize, sequence. So because the brain is hierarchical, higher level skills are based on lower level skills. If you have a hard time with these things, you might have a harder time like organizing yourself or finding things or planning things, getting stuff done. I always work best on a deadline. Yeah, yeah. I'm literally presenting at a professional conference with a loader.
They have to use that.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm good with days and nights.
Good.
Sometimes my mom or my sister, like, when such and such, when was it, and it was on this day.
Yes. So you have a skill I do not have. So that's great. And you might have really good memory skills, and that's
Some
gonna.
people say it's selective memory.
So all right, that's a modulation function. Well, I will say also that the brain, we now know from neuroscience research that when you are internally motivated for something, the brain recruits more power. So we all know that it's easier to do something if we want to do it, right? And now neuro research actually supports that. Okay, so what happens when we don't effectively integrate our senses, right? It can cause a lot of dysfunction. And some people may have dysfunction with one sensory channel, like you might be sensitive to hearing, or some people might have dysfunction with many sensory channels. And again, in a moment, we're going to go through each of the sensory channels. So people, again, might be oversensitive to some things and undersensitive to other things. So I am oversensitive to auditory input and a lot of touch input. I am undersensitive to proprioceptive input. Yeah, many of us, right? Yeah. And so I also like am clumsy. I'm just less coordinated. People who have sensory hypersensitivity, so they're oversensitive to things, tend to have more internal dysregulation and internal dysfunction, things like anxiety, depression, somatic complaints, so like more stomach aches, headaches, those kinds of things, body aches.
Yeah, I have that a lot.
So you can relate to that.
I'm only 40 and have to feel like I'm 88.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, so
Even though I can't.
I used to, my parents always listened to NPR radio, and
So
to
does
this
my
day,
mom.
yours do, well, I still cannot listen to it because my brain associates it with car sickness. I was always in the car. And when I was getting my sensory integration certification, I called my, lots of calling people, I'm advocating for myself later. So I called my mom and dad and I was like, guys, I think they kind of thought I was being a brat, being like, guys, I can't listen to this car sick. And that now I know the temporal lobe of your brain associates memories together, good or bad, right? So you might hear a favorite song and it reminds you of that time that blah, 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 or something negative. Okay, what was the last thing you ate before you threw up? Now your brain associates that negative. So people with hypersensitivities tend to have internalizing behaviors. People with sensory hyposensitivities or undersensitivities tend to have more externalizing behaviors. Those are going to be things like OCD kinds of behaviors, conduct disorders, impulse control disorders, and really people don't fit into neat little boxes because they're humans, right? So you might see both.
What about Tourette syndrome? What is that?
So Tourette syndrome is an overactivity in the brain. And so Tourette syndrome would be considered like an externalizing behavior.
Is that bad or just depends on how you manage it?
I think it depends on how you manage it. Yeah, I would say, I mean, is that bad? That's such a wonderful question. I would say my sensory differences, while they have negatively impacted me in my life, they've also made me, I think, a pretty good OT. So, you know, is it bad? Kind of, but also kind of not. Okay, so it's really important to remember that sensory processing disorders can manifest in different ways. And you don't have to be like, oh, I have to figure out exactly what my differences are and what they mean, but just be aware that, you know, somebody might have difficulty with motor planning and another person might not have any issues with that. And the severity of how much you're going to be impacted is going to ebb and flow throughout the lifespan, right? So if I've had a day where everything's gone wrong, I've had a rough day, and I come home and my husband's eating a popsicle, I might lose it, right? My poor husband. But if I have had a day where like I've had a great day, everything's gone smoothly, then I can handle that. So there's this cumulative response, both positive and negative. Okay. Now we're going to get into each of the different sensory channels. So my issues with mapping out time and space, I have to keep checking my watch because my brain is, I'm like, oh, is it 5 minutes or an hour? I don't know. Okay. So what we're going to do now is talk about each different sensory channel. And I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. And again, you have access to this presentation later. So if you want to go read more thoroughly. So for each one, I'm going to kind of define it and then talk about briefly what might be indicative of dysfunction. My examples that I give that are indicative of potential dysfunction represent both ends of the spectrum, people that are oversensitive or undersensitive, right? We want to be kind of in the middle for the best function. So we have all the sensory channels that we learned in kindergarten, right? Sound, sight, smell, taste, and touch. But we also have 3 additional sensory channels that we did not learn about in kindergarten that we need to start teaching our kids in kindergarten, which is why I really like giving this presentation to elementary schools and to kindergarten teachers and preschool teachers. So the first one is vestibular, and that's our sensation of gravity and balance. It's what lets us know when we're off balance. It's what lets us know when we are moving or stop moving, if our head's upright or down. So that's something I have issue with. My brain has a hard time with movement. Interoception, that's the one that I said was missing. That's that internal organ awareness. That's what lets us know when we're hungry, when we're cold, when we're full or not full, when we are in pain, when we are hot, when we are cold. That's our internal organ awareness. Super important when we're tired or not tired. And then proprioception, that is where our body is in space. That is where's our muscles and joints. So, and all of the internal ones, so vestibular, interoception, proprioception, and taste are going to be our biggest sensory channels that give us the most information about our body. And then the other ones, so sight, sound, smell, and taste, are going to give us more information about the world around us. They all create what I went to a course, and I love the way she said it. She's like, it's your you are here map. Where am I and where is the world around me? Okay. Oh, yep. I'm going to keep talking. Is that okay? Okay. Touch was the first one we go into. So some people with touch might have sensitivity with just one kind of touch or other kinds or multiple kinds of touch. It might be clothing textures that are difficult. And again, representing both ends of the spectrum, people that have difficulty with touch that are undersensitive might be people that are touching everything, which could be a problem either socially or behaviorally. And people that are people that are oversensitive might be avoiding touch. So my son, my little 3-year-old, almost 3, is very sensitive to touch. So things like brushing his teeth feel really yucky for him. If I do it with a dry toothbrush, he does better. But if it's a wet toothbrush, it makes him like literally almost gag. Hair washing's tough. He does not wear shorts. The first summer he's been old enough to be like, he's advocating for himself. He's like, I don't want to wear shorts. And at first I was like, is it just because it's new, different? But I think it's the touch of the shorts on his legs. Does not like my hair down, I think, because it brushes up against him and touches him. So People that are sensitive to touch, you may see it exhibit in avoidance behaviors, like they're going to be people that might not be stuffing the Thanksgiving turkey, right? Or people that might be like not wanting to go to the beach and be in the sand. I have a friend who we're going kayaking and we're going to the beach first, and she was literally wearing rain boots so the sand wouldn't touch her, which is fine, right? Proprioception. Oh. Yeah.
So like the
Yep.
internal ones would be like you have stomach ache or like
Yes.
gas flow, like I've seen earlier.
Yep. Absolutely.
I haven't noticed that things like more tonight.
Oh, poor lady. I'm sorry that you guys have to deal with that.
Yeah, but like you were saying that for me, I might message my mom would get more better rest from me.
Mhm. It's interesting, right? Those links. Yeah. And I work with many families where everybody in the family has sensory differences, but they might be very opposite from one another. And that can be really tough, especially because it can look like a behavioral choice. And when you have modulation difficulties, it can be a moving target. What might bother me more on one day might bother me less on another day, which again makes it look like a behavioral choice. Why are you choosing to make a big deal about wearing jeans today versus not? I was figuring out what I was going to wear today, and I had pants on, and I was like, nope, they don't feel right. I've literally worn those pants before to present, and they just did not feel right. Okay, so I'm not going to read through all of these. You guys can hopefully have access to this later and look at it, but these again are examples of being oversensitive or undersensitive. So the vestibular system, the structures are located in your inner ears, and people that might be undersensitive to vestibular input might be people that are constantly craving movement or are never feeling dizzy. Those are people that might really like roller coasters. I'm the purse holder at Busch Gardens. I will hold your purse and I will take your picture. I will not ride the roller coaster. But interestingly enough, to your question earlier, I always as a kid could ride the log flume. And I was like, why? I can't do roller coasters, but the log flume, it's because the touch from the water helped to regulate me. Figured that out later on in life. Yeah. So you might see fear, or the opposite end, fear or avoidant of movement. And then you might see like more motion sickness or car sickness.
So
Yes.
like water.
Exactly. If I go to water country, I need someone to hold my purse. Yes. Yes. So sometimes I'll have kids that will have a really hard time with hair washing, my son being one of them. And is it a touch thing, or is it, is it a vestibular thing? Do you not like your head into backward space? All those things are factors. Okay. Proprioceptive system. So I want to give a quick example of what is proprioception. I want everyone to lift up their left pointer finger. Yep. Yep, nice. So some people were faster, some people were slower, some people had used compensatory strategies, left and then look around. Yeah.
I don't know my left right. Usually what I do now is to keep a bracelet or a hairband.
There you go.
But I wasn't looking at it.
So you find ways to compensate. Okay, so it's your proprioception that allows you to know where that left pointer finger is, right? Okay, now bear with me. Arms straight out.
Oh, okay. I didn't
Flip them, cross them,
cross.
grab them.
Wait, what?
You're doing great. You got it. You got it. Okay, now go under.
Under.
Ow.
Yep. Now I want this is brain gym.
I was so glad this was.
I love you. Had a good OT. All right. I want everyone to now lift up their right pointer. Oh, some of you were still pretty fast. Okay. So many times, that's okay. So just going through that exercise, if it was harder to do it with your body all crossed, then that sort of puts you in the shoes of what it might be like to be somebody that has difficulty with proprioceptive processing skills, right? Because it was, some people are like, okay, that took me longer, I had to talk it out loud. Now, if you had trouble just following the directions to even get there, then that also might be somebody that has a little bit of difficulty with proprioception, right? Okay, does anybody want to jump? Okay. Is anybody, all right, if you want to, I'll give you another quick example and then we'll move on. Okay, so everybody who wants to, stand up and touch your toes. Doesn't matter how far you get. And if you don't want to, that's totally fine too. Touch your toes. And it doesn't matter how far you get, just take note of it. Okay, now jump up and down 3 times. Okay, now touch your toes again. Okay, did anybody get farther the second time?
Maybe.
Okay, it's because we've activated your proprioceptive receptors and it gave you more information about where your body was in space. Isn't that cool? So when we have people that are in a presentation and they stand up and they walk around or they are doing these things, don't tell them to stop because they're probably trying to regulate themselves to be able to better attend to things, right? So for those of you that didn't get farther the second time, then maybe you have a higher threshold for that proprioceptive input. So proprioceptive input is kind of the magic equalizer. If we're too upregulated, it can calm us down. If we're too low, it can bring us up. And when you activate your muscles, anytime you are getting active resistance to your muscles, you're activating your proprioception. When you activate your proprioception, you are releasing serotonin in your brain, which is that feel-good hormone. So that's why people need to move. Our body interprets it as stress if we stay still too long, right? Okay. So people that might have proprioceptive dysfunction might be people that are clumsy, might be people that are always slamming into things, breaking things. These are the people that get in trouble. Like we literally have plastic plates at my house because we break the regular ones, right? I used to always, I remember I worked at a restaurant and my boss was like, you sound like an elephant walking around. I'm like, I'm just walking because I have proprioceptive differences. So I don't grade my movements very well. You might see more fidgeting, more mouthing of objects, more chewing on things, or difficulty with motor planning, as I mentioned, the clumsy. Okay, visual system. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Again, these are examples of people that are oversensitive or undersensitive. And I want to make sure everybody knows that if you have visual processing or auditory processing problems, for example, that's not an acuity issue. You might be nearsighted or farsighted and not have any of those issues, or you might not be nearsighted or farsighted and have many processing issues. Yeah.
I just had an interest.
Oh, congrats. Awesome. So your visual acuity is probably great now, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything for your visual processing skills. So visual processing is like, can you pick things out of a background? Can you find what you're looking for? Can you tune out things visually? I have a hard time if I see people like that are wearing something I like, I have to like compliment it right away because my brain gets distracted if I don't. So. Yes.
I don't like crowds.
Potentially. So if you have trouble finding things in a crowd or finding people in a crowd, that might mean you have difficulty with visual modulation, like tuning out what you need to tune out, or you might have difficulty with visual processing, like can you pick something out of a background? And there's many different kinds of visual skills. I know we're over on time, so exactly. So anybody that needs to step out, please do so. I'm going to keep talking. So, okay. Auditory system, signs of potential problems, again, oversensitive or undersensitive, might be like sensitivity to loud noises or not noticing noises. Has any?
You made a mistake. The smell is olfactory or is that the sound?
Smell is olfactory. Yep.
And then nose, no, it's noise, never mind.
Yeah. They're similar. Visual processing, maybe. Okay. So has anybody ever had that example where somebody said something, you said, what was that? And they say, never mind. And then you like answered and they're like, well, why'd you ask what it was if you heard me? That's a processing and it's not acuity, right? Yep. So my husband will get lost in his thoughts and he'll be focusing on something and I'll be saying something to him and he'll be like not responding. I'm like, why are you ignoring me? And he's like, give me a tactile cue. You know, so, which is when you're like, excuse me, time to take out the trash. Okay, so you might hear like requested repeated directions or huh or what, or just oversensitivity, like my sound sensitivity.
What about my health?
Yes, yes. Oh. Yep. So people that have interoceptive differences might have difficulty knowing when they're hungry or when they're full, when they're thirsty. These might be people that get hangry because they don't feel that gradual buildup of hunger, and then all of a sudden they're starving. My husband has a really high pain threshold, so we have a rule that he's not allowed to decide if he needs stitches. I get to decide that because he doesn't feel that pain, the same way, even though his body is still impacted by it. All right. So people with interoceptive dysfunction, again, might not realize when they're in pain. They might not realize when they're full. Yeah. Yes, yep, that would be hypersensitivity. Yes. Isn't it validating? And you might be hypersensitive to some aspects of interoception, but hyposensitive to others too. Absolutely, which makes it really confusing, right?
What about like, I struggle with regular things, something like audiobooks?
Yeah. So
or at least like.
You need that multi-sensory, hearing it and seeing it.
Yeah, or at least hearing like NPR on the radio.
Yep.
Or audiobooks in library.
Okay, we got 5 minutes before lunch.
So what does that mean?
All right, so that means you are good at figuring out what your sensory preferences are if you prefer hearing it rather than reading it.
And what does it mean?
It just might mean that that's your preferred sensory input that feels best for you. Yep, for auditory input might be the way you learn. So I'm not going to spend too much time on smell and taste. The primary reason that we have smell and taste is to protect us from noxious stimuli. We have to be able to smell if food is rotten or if something tastes bad. We have to be able to smell if there's fire. So smell and taste is primarily for that.
Me for smell, like I can smell everything, but nothing really smells
Same.
bad to me.
Oh, that I wish I could say that. Same.
Like I have there's been like messes in my room where I'm like, I can't smell it as bad. I just
Yep.
smell it as a smell.
Yeah, that's interesting. So then that has to do with preferences too. Okay, we're in the conclusion. So thank you for bearing with me. Okay, so it is all about what is functional. If you have all these different sensory preferences or dislikes, but you're able to function, then it's not a problem. If you're functioning in this zone or this zone, that means that there is a little bit of dysfunction.
Yes.
And again, might be a greater risk for like anxiety or depression or stomach aches or headaches. And if you're in the red zone, that's going to be dysfunction. So sometimes I'll get families that'll be like, oh, they have things they like and don't like, but none of their functions inhibited. That's not necessarily a sign that you need OT. All right.
I have a quick question.
Yep.
What if like you ever like smell? I don't know what that smell is bad or good.
So you have to find other ways to compensate by checking food labels or dates to see. Yep.
I can't smell anything that's bad. My mom's like, do you smell poop? I'm like, I smell something. Like, I don't know. Poop.
So that's when you have to find other ways to kind of compensate.
Yes.
I think we're kind of asking us to kind of end.
Okay.
So we can get to lunch.
All right, thank you guys for coming. We have like 2 slides left that you're welcome to look at later. These are just generic tips that are helpful for everybody. It's not appropriate for me to give clinical tips in a setting where I have not evaluated. So these are general tips, and here's more resources. Thank you guys for coming.
Paper, copy of the.
I remember it smells bad.
Yeah, well, actually, you know what?